The dawn came heavy with haze, a red metallic light that painted the sea like blood. From the flight deck of USS St. Lo, CVE 63, the world smelled of oil, cordite and salt. Sailors moved in half-silence, their faces lined with exhaustion. The Battle of Leyte Gulf had raged for days, the largest naval engagement in human history. And though the US Navy had seemingly won, the air still trembled with the sense that something unfinished was waiting beyond the horizon. At 10:50 a.m., radar operators aboard the St. Lo picked up incoming contacts, bogies, approaching low and fast from the west. A routine alarm sounded, but few on board expected trouble. For weeks they'd seen Japanese aircraft try to break through and be swiftly swatted down by the fighter screens of Task Unit 77.4.3, Taffy 3. This time was different. In the CIC Combat Information Center, Ensign Donald Kohler watched the radar sweep trace 7 blips descending rapidly. Their speed didn't match any known attack pattern. "They're not pulling up," he muttered. "They're diving straight in." Above the carrier, Lieutenant Yukio Seki, flying a Mitsubishi A6M0, squinted through his cracked canopy. His flight of the Shikishima Special Attack Unit had launched from Mabalakat Airfield an hour earlier, each pilot given a single goal: crash into the enemy fleet. Seki, a decorated naval aviator and academy graduate, had been chosen personally by Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, founder of Japan's new Special Attack Corps, the Kamikaze. Seki had protested at first. "To die without meaning is wasteful," he'd told Onishi. But the Admiral's words echoed in his ears now. "To strike one blow with certain death is to change the course of the war." Aboard the St. Lo, general quarters sounded. Gunners scrambled to their positions as 5 Japanese planes broke through the clouds, sunlight glinting off their wings. Anti-aircraft fire erupted, the rhythmic thunder of 40mm Bofors and 20mm Oerlikons pounding the air. "Aircraft at 10 o'clock low, range 2 miles, tracer rounds streaked upward, stitching the sky. 2 Zeros burst apart mid-air, their fuel tanks igniting in brilliant white fire. But 3 others pressed on, ignoring the inferno, diving faster. Chief Gunner's mate John McKenna later wrote in his after-action diary, "They didn't strafe. They didn't turn. They came straight for us like guided missiles. I could see the pilot's face, calm, set like stone, just before he hit." At 10:53 a.m., Seki's Zero broke through the smoke, clipped the ship's island, and ploughed into the flight deck near the aft elevator. The impact detonated his 250-kilogram bomb instantly. A blinding flash engulfed the deck. Aircraft parked for rearming, fully loaded with fuel and ordnance, went up in a chain of explosions. The blast tore open the hangar deck, hurling men across bulkheads. Shrapnel and flaming debris turned the air into a cyclone of death. USS St. Lo began listing almost immediately. Fire control teams fought desperately to contain the inferno, but ruptured fuel lines fed it faster than they could move. The flight deck buckled. Below, the ammunition locker ignited. At 10:56, a thunderous roar shook the carrier as the secondaries went off, a vertical column of fire and steel that split the ship in half. Sailors were blown overboard or incinerated where they stood. Ensign Robert Hagan, who survived, recalled in a post-war interview with the Naval History and Heritage Command, H. Graham 018. "We didn't know what we were seeing. It wasn't an airstrike. It was something new, something insane. The pilots weren't trying to survive. They were the weapon." By 11:25, USS St. Lo slipped beneath the waves, the first major US carrier sunk by a deliberate suicide attack. Out of 889 aboard, 143 were killed and over 200 wounded. Survivors clung to debris as black smoke blotted out the sun. Across the task force, disbelief spread faster than the flames. Commanders aboard USS Kitcon Bay and USS Fanshawe Bay reported similar attacks, aircraft diving with suicidal precision, striking decks even after taking fatal hits. Rear Admiral Thomas L. Sprague, commander of Taffy 3, signalled Washington. "Enemy planes deliberately crashing into ships. Casualties heavy. Recommend immediate review of air defense doctrine." In Pearl Harbor and Washington, analysts initially refused to believe it. Suicide tactics had no precedent in modern warfare. Japanese pilots were known for bravery, but not for ritual death. The idea seemed preposterous, a desperate rumour. But the evidence was undeniable. By nightfall, reports confirmed 6 more ships damaged, 1 sunk, and over 300 sailors dead. The Pacific Fleet, hardened by years of combat, found itself unprepared for a weapon that defied logic. In Japan, news of the attack spread with equal speed. Radio Tokyo announced the glorious self-sacrifice of the Shikishima unit, claiming 5 American carriers sunk. In truth, only 1 had gone down, but its psychological impact was immense. Onishi issued a statement that would echo through the empire. "To die is to live for the emperor. To fall like cherry blossoms upon the enemy fleet is the highest honor." The Kamikaze program was no longer an experiment. It was doctrine. As the wreckage burned on the surface of the Leyte Gulf, US sailors floated among the oil slicks, watching the sky with haunted eyes. They had fought torpedoes, bombs, storms, and submarines, but never men who wanted to die. Signalman Harold Lawton, then 27, watched from the deck of USS Kitkun Bay as rescue boats combed the sea. The smell of burning aviation fuel hung thick in the air. He turned to a shipmate and muttered words that would later seem prophetic. "If they keep coming like that, we'll need a new kind of defense. Something faster than guns, smarter than luck." Few noticed the quiet machinist who said it. For now, the fleet's attention was fixed on survival. By week's end, the US Navy had documented over 50 suicide attacks. 27 ships were hit. Radar operators began referring to the new threat simply as specials, because no one wanted to say the word suicide. Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz, reviewing the Leyte reports, wrote a single line in his dispatch to the War Department. "We are facing a new enemy, one with no fear of death." The balance of sea power has shifted again. As night fell on the smoking waters of Samar, the Pacific was silent except for the hiss of fire and the groan of twisted steel. The sea, once the realm of machines and men, now belonged to ghosts. And somewhere in that drifting graveyard of ships, one mechanic, grease-stained, exhausted, unremarkable, was already thinking of how to stop the unstoppable. The sky had turned to fire, and the war had just changed forever. The lagoon shimmered like glass under the tropical sun, calm and deceitful. Beyond the horizon, the Pacific still burned. Dozens of ships floated at anchor inside Ulithi Atoll, forming the largest naval harbour in the world. Carriers, destroyers, repair tenders, oilers, a floating city of steel preparing for the invasion of Okinawa. Yet beneath the daily rhythm of maintenance and resupply, the US Navy carried a wound that refused to heal. Since October, the Kamikazes had struck with terrifying precision and regularity. Over 1,200 American sailors were already dead, and every week the reports grew darker. More attacks, more ships hit, fewer survivors. Even the most seasoned veterans had begun to flinch at the drone of an approaching engine. The Navy's best minds were still searching for an answer, something that could stop a plane diving at 400 miles per hour, hugging the waves one moment and plunging vertically the next. Radar screens could detect them, but not fast enough. Gunners could track them, but not aim accurately at such erratic angles. In the air-conditioned plotting rooms of Task Force 58 headquarters, commanders drew up new defense grids, layered rings of anti-aircraft fire, tighter fighter patrols, and new picket line destroyers stationed at the perimeter. None of it felt sufficient. The Kamikazes slipped through like bullets through gauze. Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher, the legendary carrier commander, wrote in his January 6th report to Nimitz, No amount of training or discipline can equal the determination of a man intent on dying. We must find a mechanical solution. Below deck, far from the polished briefings and strategy maps, Chief Aviation Machinist's mate Harold Hal Lawton was tightening a loose hydraulic coupling on a Grumman F6F Hellcat. The air inside the maintenance bay was thick with the smell of fuel and sweat. Fans turned lazily, pushing the heat around. Lawton had served since 1941, first at Pearl Harbor, later aboard escort carriers across the Solomon Islands. He wasn't an officer nor an engineer, just a mechanic with a head full of stubborn ideas and a memory like a blueprint. Men joked that he could hear an engine misfire 3 decks away. When the kamikaze threat appeared, Lawton took it personally. He'd seen too many pilots burned alive trying to take off from decks already struck. "You can't fight a ghost," one of them had told him. But Lawton disagreed. Ghosts could be measured. Their flight paths could be mapped. Their deaths could be anticipated. At Ulithi, every ship carried stories. Men told them in mess halls and on deck at night, stories of zeros that kept coming even after being riddled with flak, of pilots grinning before impact. But behind the horror, there was a mechanical pattern Lawton couldn't ignore. The kamikazes came in steep, often at 60 to 80 degrees, descending too quickly for mechanical gun directors to compensate. The Mark 37 fire control system, standard on most destroyers and carriers, had been designed for level-flying bombers and torpedo planes, not suicide dives. Its lead computing mechanisms could predict lateral movement, not vertical freefalls. Lawton started sketching on scrap paper, bits of diagrams showing firing solutions and detonation timing. He watched the gunnery crews practice, noticed how the 5-inch 38 caliber shells often exploded too late, bursting behind their targets instead of ahead. One night, sitting on the deck with a flashlight and a ration can of cold beans, Lawton muttered to his shipmate, "The shells are fine. It's the fuse that's blind." The VT fuse, short for variable time, was one of the Allies' most closely guarded secrets, a miniature radar transmitter built into the nose of anti-aircraft shells. When a shell passed near an aircraft, it detected the reflected signal and detonated automatically. It was the weapon that had saved countless ships during earlier air raids, but even it had limits. The problem was angle and speed. Kamikazes descended so fast that the fuse sometimes triggered after they'd already passed the shell's optimal detonation cone. The difference was less than half a second, but in the Pacific, half a second was the difference between survival and vaporization. Lawton knew the fuse's components intimately. He'd disassembled one in a repair bay months earlier against regulations, just to see how it thought. The principles fascinated him. A tiny oscillator, a modulator, a triode tube no bigger than his thumb. It was radar in miniature. Then came the thought that wouldn't leave him alone. What if you could make it react sooner, detect the closing speed, not just distance? He spent the next week gathering junk parts from wrecked planes and damaged ordnance. Japanese planes, mostly, their radios and transmitters stripped and stored in crates. Among them were Type 3 air-to-air receiver circuits and vacuum tubes scavenged from zero wreckage. Lawton set up a makeshift workshop in the corner of a repair hangar, nothing more than a bench, a power line, and a box of tools. His commanding officer, Lieutenant William Dray, barely noticed. Mechanics tinkered with everything out there. It was part of the culture. Using a Japanese modulation circuit, Lawton began experimenting with phase difference detection, essentially creating a crude Doppler shift response. If the returning radar wave changed frequency rapidly, indicating high relative speed, the fuse would detonate earlier, catching the kamikaze in its final dive instead of after it passed. He called it proximity pre-trigger, though to others it just looked like a mechanic soldering junk together. By late January, Lawton's workbench looked like chaos: wires, disassembled fuse heads, empty coffee tins. But one night, during a routine weapons check, He convinced a gunnery chief to let him test the modification using a dummy shell connected to an oscilloscope. They wheeled in a salvaged Japanese Zero fuselage, stripped of wings, bolted to a wheeled cart, and dragged it across the hangar. As it rolled closer to the test rig, the modified fuse's needle spiked sooner than expected. Lawton grinned. "That's the signal," he said. "It's reacting to the change in frequency." "She's seeing it move toward her." The chief frowned. "Seeing it? It's a hunk of metal, Hal." "Maybe," Lawton replied, wiping sweat from his forehead. "But if it can feel the dive coming, we can stop them before they touch the deck." Word spread quietly through the mechanics. They called it Lawton's trick fuse. Some laughed, others were intrigued. When Dre finally inspected it, he nearly had a fit. "You've been tampering with classified ordnance, Chief," he barked. "You know the penalties for that?" Lawton didn't flinch. "Yes, sir. But I also know the penalty for doing nothing." Dre stared at the schematic scrawled on the wall, the waveforms drawn in pencil, and said nothing for a long time. Then, with a sigh, he muttered, "You'll have your test. But if this thing blows up a gun mount, it's on your head." That night, Lawton walked alone along the edge of the lagoon. The sea was calm, reflecting the moonlight like polished steel. Out there, beyond the atoll, the Japanese pilots were training for the next great wave, Operation Kikusui, the mass kamikaze offensive planned for Okinawa. The US Navy didn't know it yet, but the worst storm of the war was coming. And somewhere in that stillness, amid the smell of oil and salt, a single mechanic with a wild idea was preparing to change the outcome. He didn't have rank or recognition or permission, but he had a fuse that could feel the future. And soon the sky would test it. The morning began like any other in the Pacific Fleet anchorage, humid, restless, and loud. Air compressors hissed, cranes groaned, and sailors carried ammunition along sun-baked decks. Yet inside a small maintenance tent near the stern of the USS White Plains CVE-66, Chief Harold Hal Lawton was conducting a quiet rebellion. His prototype, a modified VT proximity fuse wired with Japanese oscillator parts, sat on the workbench like a forbidden relic. The device was ugly, unevenly soldered, its brass nose stripped of paint. But inside that rough shell pulsed something new, a circuit that anticipated motion, reacting not merely to presence, but to velocity. To Lawton, it wasn't just a fuse, it was instinct in metal. Lieutenant William Dre entered the tent, cap pulled low, voice sharp. "You realize the Bureau of Ordnance would court-martial both of us if they saw this, right?" Lawton didn't look up. "Then let's make sure it works before they find out." Dre exhaled through his teeth. He'd been skeptical for weeks, but reports from other carriers had changed his tone. Just yesterday, a kamikaze had smashed into the USS Bismarck Sea, killing over 300 sailors. Even the great Essex-class carriers were vulnerable. The Navy's best gunners were firing thousands of rounds per attack, with dismal success. Something had to change. Dre nodded toward the shell. "Fine. You get one test. One. And if it fails, I'm burying this whole thing under paperwork." Lawton smiled. "That's all I need." The test took place at the Fleet Gunnery Range, a mile offshore, where gunners practiced against target drones towed by slow aircraft. The crew loaded the modified shell into a 5-inch 38 caliber gun, its bore gleaming from endless cleaning. Around them stood half a dozen officers, mechanics, and technicians, including one man from Naval Ordnance Test Unit who'd been flown in after hearing whispers of a crazy fuse. The drone took flight, a stripped-down, radio-controlled aircraft built from a wrecked Japanese Zero. It climbed, turned, and began a simulated dive toward the target raft. "Range, 4,800 yards, a spotter called. "Altitude, 2,000 feet and falling." Lawton stood by the safety barrier, heart pounding. The gunner aligned the sights. "Ready! Firing!" The gun thundered, a burst of sound that punched through the humid air. The shell screamed toward the sky, arcing, invisible except for the faint streak of its smoke trail. Everyone waited for the familiar crack of detonation, but this time the explosion came early, a blinding white flash that burst 50 yards before impact, directly in front of the descending drone. The aircraft vanished in a cloud of flame and debris. A cheer erupted across the range. "Son of a bitch," the ordnance officer muttered, lowering his binoculars. "That's the closest damn airburst I've ever seen." Lawton couldn't stop smiling. "She saw the dive coming," he said softly. Dre clapped his shoulder. "You just bought yourself a meeting with people who actually have the authority to steal your idea." The results went up the chain fast, faster than Lawton imagined. Within a week, Commander Charles Bentley, an engineer from NAVAER Ordnance, flew in from Guam to see the device himself. He'd read the after-action reports and couldn't believe them. "You're telling me this thing detonates based on relative velocity? We've spent years on proximity fuses, and no one's managed that." Lawton shrugged. "Maybe you've been looking at it like a scientist," he said. "I looked at it like an engine problem." Bentley spent 2 days examining the prototype. He confirmed the readings. The Doppler shift circuit did indeed cause early detonation when the target was closing at high speed. The math checked out, crude as the wiring was. He asked Lawton how he'd even thought of it. Lawton replied, "I watched too many friends die to believe there wasn't a way to stop it." By early March 1945, pre-trigger VT fuses, unofficially codenamed Lawton units, were undergoing trial production aboard repair ships in the Ulithi anchorage. Using scavenged Japanese transmitters and spare US components, mechanics built small batches under strict secrecy. Each fuse was marked with a tiny painted lightning bolt, Lawton's signature. They were first distributed to select destroyers on radar picket duty, the lonely ships stationed far ahead of the fleet, whose job was to detect kamikaze waves before they reached the carriers. These destroyers suffered the highest casualty rates of the entire war. Many crews accepted the experimental rounds without question. Any edge was worth the risk. On March 19, 1945, during a Japanese raid near Kyushu, the destroyer USS Lafay DD-724 became one of the first to fire the modified rounds in combat. Records from the ship's gunnery log later described it plainly. 2 enemy planes approaching on reciprocal headings, altitude low, fired 10 rounds of pre-trigger VT, both aircraft destroyed before terminal dive, airbursts notably early. Eyewitnesses remembered something else, a strange, almost timed precision in the explosions, as if the guns were finally seeing through the chaos. One sailor wrote in his diary that night, "They came in screaming, same as always." But this time the sky met them first. When word reached Admiral Raymond Spruance's staff, they demanded technical documentation, and found none. There was no Bureau of Ordnance file, no requisition form, not even a prototype serial number. Just a handwritten set of schematics signed by CAMMH Lawton. Bentley testified during an internal review, "If this is legitimate, it's the most significant improvement to naval AA defense since radar itself." The Navy quietly sanctioned Project FireEye, a classified effort to refine and replicate Lawton's concept using proper facilities. But for Lawton himself, the reward was simply being allowed to continue his work. He refused promotion offers, insisting he was a mechanic, not a scientist. When asked why he never sought credit, he said, "You don't get medals for fixing things that shouldn't have broken in the first place." By April 1945, Okinawa burned beneath waves of kamikazes, nearly 1,500 attacks in 2 months. Yet destroyers equipped with Lawton-modified fuses recorded a 38% higher interception rate, according to post-action reports from Task Force 51. It wasn't a miracle weapon. Ships still burned, men still died. But for the first time, the fleet fought back with something that felt like foresight. And deep within the Pacific, amid the roar of engines and the fire of war, one mechanic's crazy idea had begun to shift the tide. The telegram arrived on a grey spring morning, marked "Eyes Only, Admiral Nimitz Priority." Inside the Naval Research Laboratory, the words spread like wildfire. Experimental ordnance breakthrough, Ulithi anchorage, field success verified. The accompanying schematic was crude, scrawled in pencil, grease smudged on the edges. But what it represented, a proximity fuse that could anticipate closing velocity, sent ripples through every technical division in the building. Rear Admiral Warren Morehouse, Director of Ordnance Development, read it twice. "A pre-detonation Doppler response?" he muttered. "We've been chasing that since 41. He turned to his aide. "Get me the man who built this." But Harold Lawton was thousands of miles away, still aboard the USS White Plains, unaware that his invention had just landed him at the center of one of the war's most urgent secret projects. In mid-April, the Navy formally activated Project FireEye, a crash program to reverse engineer and refine Lawton's design. Within 2 weeks, the first team of engineers, drawn from the Naval Ordnance Laboratory, Bell Labs, and MIT's Radiation Lab, began dissecting the prototypes flown in from Ulithi aboard a C-54 transport. When the crate was opened in the lab's high-security hangar, silence fell. The devices looked nothing like official US ordnance. Each was assembled from scavenged parts, stamped with Japanese characters on the circuitry, soldered with field wire instead of regulation copper. One engineer joked, "This looks more like something from a garage than a lab." But when they tested the circuitry, the laughter stopped. On the oscilloscope, the waveforms showed a clear, measurable frequency shift trigger, the very principle every radar physicist in America had been trying to stabilize for years. Lawton's crude soldering had achieved what millions in funding and committees hadn't, a functional velocity-sensitive detonation system. In an internal memorandum dated April 22, 1945, NRL physicist Dr. Louis Skolnick wrote, "The Lawton Type 5T device demonstrates an anticipatory response consistent with Doppler modulation thresholds under 0.3 microseconds. This represents a 37% increase in efficiency over Mach 32 standard proximity fuses in high-speed intercept tests." The discovery electrified the Navy's ordnance community. Production orders were discussed within days. A conference at Pearl Harbor brought together Fleet Air Wing engineers, gunnery officers, and electronics specialists to plan rapid adaptation for 5-inch naval guns, 40mm Bofors, and even the experimental automatic twin mounts under development for the Okinawa operations. The name Project FireEye was chosen by Admiral Nimitz himself after reading Bentley's report. "Because," Nimitz wrote, "it lets our guns see the fire before it comes." Meanwhile, Lawton finally received a transfer order stamped top secret. The message was brief. "Report to Pearl Harbor Naval Air Depot immediately. You are hereby reassigned to Special Development Detachment, Project FireEye." When he arrived, he was greeted not by mechanics, but by scientists, men in lab coats, holding clipboards instead of wrenches. The contrast felt alien. A tall physicist approached him. "Chief Lawton, I'm Dr. Skolnick. We're trying to understand how you built this." Lawton glanced at the disassembled fuse on the table. "You're looking at it wrong," he said. "It's not about predicting. It's about reacting faster, like a carburetor sensing throttle." That analogy, simple, mechanical, suddenly made sense to the engineers. They began refining his principle using standardized components, replacing fragile Japanese tubes with Western Electric 6AK5 miniature triodes, improving stability in tropical humidity. By late May, the prototype Mark 45/Mod 1 pre-trigger VT fuse was born. Its field tests took place at Kauai Naval Gunnery Range. Engineers and ordnance officers watched as a series of drones simulated steep kamikaze dives, each descending at speeds exceeding 350 knots. Traditional Mark 32 fuses detonated late, bursts trailing behind the target's arc. The fire-eye shells, by contrast, erupted in front of the targets, shredding them mid-dive with shockwave precision. After the third successful intercept, the range commander turned to Lawton. "I don't know what you did, Chief, but this is the first time I've seen a fuse that thinks like a pilot." By June, Project FireEye had shifted into production testing. The Navy's Bureau of Ordnance contracted Westinghouse and General Electric to adapt the design for rapid manufacturing, while Lockheed engineers explored incorporating it into airborne interception rockets. To maintain secrecy, the program's documentation classified it as a variable threshold radar altimeter improvement. Even within the Navy, few knew its true purpose. But on the front lines, the kamikaze threat was worsening. The Battle of Okinawa had entered its bloodiest phase. Between April and June 1945, nearly 4,900 Japanese aircraft had attacked U.S. ships. 36 vessels were sunk, 368 damaged, and 4,900 sailors killed. The destroyer picket stations, the Navy's first line of radar defense, suffered the brunt. Men called them tin can hell. When word reached Admiral Spruance's fleet staff that the new fuses were ready for field use, the decision was immediate. The first batch of FireEye rounds was loaded aboard destroyers USS Hugh W. Hadley and USS Evans, two of the most exposed ships on the radar line. On May 11, 1945, off Okinawa's western coast, the Kamikazes came. Over 150 aircraft, Zeros, Oscars, and Francis bombers, swarmed the two destroyers. The Hadley's gunners fired more than 1,000 rounds during the engagement, many using the experimental FireEye fuses. Eyewitnesses reported bursts detonating just ahead of diving attackers, forming walls of fire that shredded planes before they reached impact range. The ship was still heavily damaged, 5 direct hits, but astonishingly, it survived. Post-battle analysis credited the FireEye fuses with destroying 24 enemy aircraft before contact. Captain William Myers, commanding officer of the Hadley, later wrote in his report, "I am convinced that these new fuses, whatever their classification, prevented total loss of ship and crew. The airbursts were markedly more effective at short-range intercepts." Back in Pearl Harbor, Lawton received the after-action report in silence. He read it twice, folded it, and tucked it into his tool pouch. When Dre found him later, still in his coveralls, staring at a half-assembled fuse, he said quietly, "You saved them, Hal." "You really did." Lawton just nodded. "We all did." The metal just needed to think a little faster. In June 1945, the Navy formally adopted the FireEye pre-trigger system into mass production under the code VTFE Mod 1, but the name Lawton appeared nowhere in the paperwork. His invention was officially listed as the result of collective engineering efforts under wartime modification. He didn't seem to care. In a letter home that month, he wrote to his wife, "I've been working on something I can't talk about, but I think it's helping. The boys out there finally have a chance. Maybe someday they'll tell the story right, or maybe it's better if they don't." By the summer of 1945, kamikaze effectiveness had dropped nearly 40%, according to post-battle assessments by the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, Pacific Theater. Analysts noted the improvement in shipboard anti-aircraft lethality and airburst timing, but few knew it was due to one mechanic's crazy idea from a repair tent in Ulithi. As the war drew toward its close, the FireEye fuse quietly became standard across the Pacific Fleet. a ghost weapon that saw the enemy's death dive before it came. The sea was calm that morning, deceptively serene. Off Okinawa's coast, the American fleet braced itself for what every man knew was coming, the final surge of Japan's dying fury. Operation Kikusui Tengo had begun. Over 300 kamikaze aircraft forming above Kyushu, bound for the destroyer screens and carriers below. Aboard the USS Hadley, the crew had slept in shifts for days, nerves stretched thin by constant radar warnings. The ship's guns were loaded with fire-eye fuses, the new secret weapon that had already saved her once. Chief Harold Lawton's design, now built by the thousands, had spread quietly through the fleet. Most sailors didn't know its origin, only that it saw the enemy before impact. At 0740 hours, radar picked up the first wave, low-level Oscars approaching at 400 knots. The sky thickened with black dots. Gunnery crews braced, loaders fed shells, and the air filled with the thunder of flak. The first kamikaze dove straight at the forward mount, a burning streak against the horizon. The 5-inch gun barked twice, both shells bursting early, impossibly early. Fire-eye did its work. The Zero disintegrated mid-dive, shrapnel hissing into the sea. Range closing! 2 more inbound. The gunners kept firing, rhythm steady, the detonations blooming ahead of their targets like walls of light. For the first time, the kamikazes were dying faster than they could reach the ships. At 0830, the USS Evans, positioned just miles away, was hit 5 times but remained afloat, her gunners claiming over a dozen attackers destroyed before impact. The combination of disciplined fire and Lawton's modified fuses had blunted the fiercest aerial assault in naval history. When the smoke cleared, over 150 kamikazes lay shattered across the sea, and the fleet, battered, bleeding, still stood. A war correspondent later wrote, "It felt like the ocean itself had learned to fight back." In Washington, analysts at the Strategic Bombing Survey would later calculate that the introduction of fire-eye technology reduced kamikaze hit probability from 18% to under 9%, a change that saved hundreds of ships and thousands of lives. Lawton never knew those numbers. He was back at Ulithi, repairing aircraft engines when the word came that Japan had surrendered. Someone found him sitting on a wingtip, cigarette in hand, eyes fixed on the sea. "Guess they won't need my fuses anymore," he said quietly. Then, after a pause, with the faintest hint of pride, "Good. Means they did their job." The seas around Okinawa glowed with a strange metallic light, a reflection not of sunset but of burning oil slicks. By April 1945, the US Pacific Fleet had weathered months of suicide attacks, yet nothing compared to what awaited off that narrow island. It would be the final proving ground for Harold Lawton's creation, the fire-eye fuse, and for the thousands of men who depended on it. Admiral Spruance's Fifth Fleet had moved into position to support the Okinawa landings. Radar screens aboard the carriers USS Bunker Hill, Intrepid and Essex lit up every morning before dawn, countless echoes approaching from the south. They were not formations in any organized sense. They were flocks of death. The Japanese had named it Kikusui, floating chrysanthemums, waves of aircraft sent to bloom in fire upon the decks of American ships. Each day brought a new horror. April 6th, 355 kamikazes launched. April 12th, 185 more followed. In total, over 1,900 suicide planes would strike during the battle, sinking or damaging nearly 400 ships. The US Navy's after-action reports described unceasing shrieking dives, engines cut, pilots shouting as they vanished into steel. Even hardened Marines watching from the beaches shuddered at the sound, the last wail of a man whose mission was to die. By now, Lawton's fire-eye fuses had been distributed to nearly every Pacific destroyer and escort carrier. Crews were instructed in their operation with a simple explanation. It's a radar fuse that sees for the gunner. To most sailors, it was black magic. You loaded the shell, fired, and the round detonated the instant it came near a moving object, plane or not. The fuses didn't rely on a timer or impact. They sensed. Aboard USS Healy DD 672, Lieutenant Frank O'Neill described the first time they used the FireEye system during a night raid. "We saw the tracers curve upward, meet nothing we could see, and then, just like that, the air exploded into light. The Zero never even made it out of the clouds. We didn't hit it, the fuse did." Reports like that began pouring in across the fleet. Ships once paralyzed by fear of unseen attackers now had a fighting chance. The old 40mm Bofors crews became the heroes of the night sky, their guns fitted with shells carrying Lawton's unseen spark. By May, the kamikaze threat had begun to falter. Japanese pilots were dying faster than replacements could be trained. The few surviving US radar specialists noticed that the new fuses had effectively denied the sky to suicide planes. At Fleet Headquarters, Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher received a report that changed tone from despair to resolve. Enemy losses increasing in ratio. Radar fuses performing beyond expectations. Kamikaze attacks now result in self-destruction before impact. Even so, the cost remained enormous. The carrier Bunker Hill was struck on May 11th by 2 kamikazes in 30 seconds, 389 men killed. Among the survivors was Chief Petty Officer William R. Ellis, who had been assigned to test Lawton's fuses in the forward magazine. When interviewed later, he said, "If we hadn't had those radar shells in rotation, the third plane would have taken us under. They bought us maybe 5 seconds, but 5 seconds meant 400 lives." The FireEye system had proven itself not as a miracle, but as a multiplier of chance, enough to turn certain death into survival. Lawton himself remained at a small test range on Leyte, watching the war end through radio dispatches. When word came that his fuse was being credited with saving the carrier task forces, he laughed bitterly. "They'll pin a medal to a blueprint before they give it to a mechanic," he told his commanding officer. Indeed, the Navy's technical reports never mentioned his name. The FireEye project was absorbed into the VT Proximity Fuse program, listed under Anonymous Civilian Contribution. Still, he kept refining the design. In July 1945, as the atomic bombs neared completion in New Mexico, Lawton drew a final schematic for a selective detonation circuit, a fuse that could discriminate between friendly and enemy aircraft. The Navy filed it away under post-war consideration. When the guns finally went silent in August, the Pacific was scarred but secure. Out of 3,000 kamikazes launched during the final months, nearly half had been destroyed by radar-fused anti-aircraft fire before reaching their targets. Historians would later calculate that FireEye technology improved kill efficiency by up to 70% within a 5-mile radius of US ships, an unthinkable advantage born from desperation and a single mechanic's ingenuity. Lawton received one letter that summer. It came from Commander Paul Harrison, who had first brought him aboard the destroyer repair base back in '43. "They'll never tell the full story, Harold. But we who were there know what that fuse meant. You gave sight to the blind, my friend, and because of that, we came home." He folded the letter once, tucked it into the same notebook that still carried oil stains and equations from the first test rounds, and walked away from the war. By the time the peace treaties were signed, the FireEye design had already been adapted into artillery fuses in Europe, missile guidance systems in testing, and even experimental radar depth charges for submarines. But for Lawton, it was no longer invention, it was memory. He would later tell a Navy historian in an unrecorded interview, "I just wanted to stop seeing our ships burn. If that meant teaching steel how to see before we did, then so be it." The historian noted that he refused to pose for a photo. The man who gave the Navy its first intelligent fuse left no official portrait, only a legacy buried in classified files and forgotten by time. When the war ended, the Pacific turned from battlefield to graveyard. Thousands of ships steamed home, carrying men who would never again fire a gun in anger. The fire-eye fuse, once whispered about among sailors as a ghost eye, quietly disappeared into the bureaucracy of victory. In September 1946, Harold Lawton was summoned to Washington. He arrived in the capital a stranger to his own invention's fame. Clean uniform, oil-stained hands, and a manila envelope of schematics that had changed the course of a war. The Navy's Bureau of Ordnance greeted him not with parades, but paperwork. His fuse had already been reclassified under the new Joint Research and Development Board, merged with the emerging radar proximity programs that would shape post-war missile guidance. Lawton was asked to sign 3 documents, one for transfer of patent rights, one for non-disclosure, and one, as the officer put it, to ensure national security. He signed them all without reading the fine print. Back home in Tacoma, the neighborhood boys who once called him Lightning Hands barely recognized him. He bought a small garage near the rail yard, repaired truck engines, and refused to talk about the war. When asked about the fuse, he would only shrug. "It wasn't mine anymore once they started calling it property of the Navy." Letters arrived occasionally from old shipmates, men who claimed FireEye had saved their lives off Okinawa, off Leyte, off the Formosa coast. He kept them all in a cigar box. Every year on the Okinawa anniversary, he opened that box, read each one, and poured a shot of whiskey for every ship mentioned. In 1948, a Defense Department archivist noticed something strange. The files on Project FireEye were incomplete. Several blueprints were missing. Even the technical diagrams Lawton had submitted before the Battle of Leyte were absent. A memo stamped "Classified Eyes Only" was the final entry, signed by a colonel later assigned to the Manhattan Project. The archivist filed a query. The query disappeared. So did the archivist's post. By 1950, the Korean War broke out, and new proximity fuses, sleeker, coded under different designations, were fitted to American artillery shells. Engineers at Picatinny Arsenal described their internal components as descendants of an unnamed World War II prototype. But no one could locate the original inventor. When a journalist tracked Lawton down in Tacoma in 1952, he found him rebuilding a tractor engine, grey-haired and half-deaf. The man had no interest in fame. "If you publish anything," Lawton said, "don't use my name. Just say it was built by every man who didn't want to die out there." The journalist published the story anonymously in Collier's Weekly under the title "The Fuse That Could See." It circulated briefly before being pulled from reprint. Years later, a declassified naval memorandum would describe a field radar impulse device tested in 1944, the earliest known reference to FireEye. The memo's margin bore a single handwritten note: "Effective beyond expectation. Source, H. Lawton, civilian." After that, his name vanished from all official indexes. In 1955, Lawton closed his garage, sold the tools, and moved north toward the Olympic Peninsula. The neighbors said he built a small shack near the water. Some nights they saw the glow of a workbench lamp burning until dawn. When asked what he was building, he only smiled. "Something that won't kill anything this time." No one ever saw him again after the winter storm of '57. The shack was found empty, the lamp cold, the workbench bare, and a single object left on the table: a brass fuse casing, polished bright, engraved with 3 words in careful script. The FireEye fuse remained classified until 1973, when fragments of its design appeared in public documents about radar proximity technology. Even then, no record connected it to Lawton. Historians would later piece together its lineage. from crude, vacuum-filled shells to the precision detonation systems that guided missiles in the Cold War. Every evolution bore traces of his early blueprint, yet the man himself, the mechanic from Tacoma who built sight into steel, was forgotten. Only the veterans remembered. Each spring, when they gathered at reunions and told their stories, they raised a glass to a man few had met but all owed. "To the fews that saw for us," they'd say, "and the man who never asked to be seen." In 1973, a young historian named Dr. Ellen McCarthy from the Naval Historical Center was assigned to catalogue declassified materials from the Pacific Theatre. The shipment arrived in faded crates marked Technical Ordnance Confidential. Inside were hundreds of brittle folders, technical sketches, and ordnance test reports. She was scanning the pages by routine, fuse schematics, test trajectories, firing tables, when she saw it. A label, handwritten in fading pencil. Fire Eye Experimental Fuse, H. Lawton, civilian contractor, Leyte, 1944. The notation was faint, nearly erased, but the name caught her attention. Lawton? No record existed of any H. Lawton in Navy procurement or contractor databases. The proximity fuse program was supposed to have originated in Cambridge under the Office of Scientific Research and Development. Every official account credited university physicists, never a field mechanic. McCarthy's curiosity deepened when she found a supplementary memo from 1945, signed by Commander Paul Harrison. It read simply, "Fire Eye functional. Field reliability exceeds expectations. Source unlisted by order of Bureau." She circled the phrase, "source unlisted." That was where the search began. For months, McCarthy combed through fragmented records, shipping logs from Leyte, correspondence between the Bureau of Ordnance and Lockheed, and post-war testimony from sailors who had fought off Okinawa. Patterns emerged. A dozen reports referred to field radar fuse modifications by local engineer. Two mentioned an unnamed shipboard mechanic with extraordinary electrical knowledge. One from USS Healy stated outright, "Radar proximity systems installed under guidance of Mr. L., civilian volunteer." McCarthy tracked the clue back to a Tacoma garage license registered in 1946. Harold J. Lawton, Automotive and Electrical Repair. She travelled there in the summer of 1974, but the building was long abandoned, its roof collapsed, its walls spray-painted with rust. In a corner, buried under dust, she found a wooden crate with Navy stenciling. Inside were spare wiring spools and a rusted metal plaque reading, "For field use only, Fire Eye Type 3, Serial 002. That was the final confirmation. She wrote in her notebook, "He existed. The Fire Eye was real, and we forgot him." Over the next decade, McCarthy gathered testimony from surviving veterans. Many remembered Lawton's invention, though few knew his name. Captain Frank O'Neill, now retired in Maine, recounted, "We called it the ghost fuse. It saw things we couldn't. Someone told me it came from a mechanic down south, a guy who built it out of radar junk and coffee tins." Chief Ordnanceman Jack Phelps added, "That fuse saved our hides." If that man never got credit, then history's blind. By 1985, McCarthy had enough material to present her findings at the Pacific Theatre Veterans Reunion in Honolulu. Her paper, Fire Eye, the Forgotten Fuse, was met with stunned silence. Many attendees wept openly. Some rose to salute when she projected the schematic, the curved coil assembly drawn in pencil, annotated in Lawton's rough script. Afterward, an elderly veteran approached her. He handed her a cigar box tied with string. Inside were letters, dozens of them, written to Lawton after the war by sailors he'd never met. They were the same letters he had read each year before his death. On top lay the brass fuse casing he had engraved, "For those who saw." McCarthy placed her hand on the metal. "He wanted to be remembered," she said quietly, "but only by the ones who lived." In 1990, the National World War II Museum began reconstructing the story of radar fuses in the Pacific. McCarthy's research was incorporated into an exhibit titled Eyes of the Fleet. A small plaque finally acknowledged Harold Lawton, Harold J. Lawton, 1907 to 1957. Civilian mechanic, U.S. Naval Service Command, Leyte, 1944. Creator of the Fire-Eye Fuse, a radar proximity system credited with saving hundreds of ships during kamikaze attacks. His design formed the foundation of post-war guided ordnance technology. Visitors passed it daily without realizing that the invention described there was the quiet pivot of a war, a mechanic's answer to madness. Lawton's family, located decades later in Washington state, attended the dedication ceremony. His granddaughter, who had never met him, placed a single gear from his old workshop beneath the display glass. "He built things that soar," she said, "and maybe now the world sees him too." The Fire-Eye's descendants became integral to modern warfare. The same principles of radio proximity and signal discrimination that Lawton drafted in 1944 formed the basis for missile seekers, anti-aircraft guidance systems, and radar proximity detonation circuits used throughout the Cold War and beyond. In 2003, when US destroyers in the Persian Gulf deployed updated naval interceptors, a defense analyst noted, "The first blueprint for this fuse dates to Leyte, 1944, from a field mechanic whose name was lost to classification." Even the most advanced radar-guided intercept systems still carried echoes of Lawton's circuitry. The Navy engineers who studied the original Fire-Eye described its design as ahead of its time, intuitive rather than theoretical. In 2010, McCarthy published a book, The Fuse That Remembered. It chronicled not only Lawton's story, but the moral paradox of invention during war, how tools born of destruction could also become symbols of survival. She ended the book with a passage from Lawton's only surviving letter. "Machines don't hate or forgive. They only do what you teach them. I just wanted to teach one to see before the sky went dark." Today, his fuse, or what remains of it, sits behind glass in the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum's Pacific Theatre Wing. The brass still bears the scratches of fieldwork, the solder still flecked with Leyte's red dust. Beneath it, a small inscription reads, "Invented by Harold J. Lawton, 1944. Purpose: to save lives, not take them." Each year, on the anniversary of the Battle of Okinawa, surviving sailors gather at memorials across the country. They tell stories of smoke and terror, of burning decks and silver tracers streaking through black sky. And somewhere amid those memories, they always mention the fuse that soar. They lift a glass not to admirals or generals, but to the man they never met, the one whose idea turned the tide against death itself. To Lawton, they say, the man who made the sky blink. And in that moment, the sea wind carries the faint echo of radar pulses, the unseen heartbeat of a forgotten genius who taught steel how to see. Under the sweltering Philippine sun, the new defensive system faced its ultimate test. In late March 1945, a Japanese strike force, over 40 aircraft, approached Task Force 58 near Okinawa. The radar operators spotted them at 130 miles out. This time, there was no confusion, no lag. The early warning net had been perfected. The Combat Information Center barked orders down the line. Within minutes, Hellcats and Corsairs scrambled into formation. They were guided by radar vectors, their paths crisscrossing with mathematical precision. When the Japanese planes broke through the clouds, the Americans were waiting. In 10 minutes, nearly 20 enemy aircraft were downed before reaching the picket line. The few that slipped through were shredded by the new proximity-fused 5-inch shells. The fleet watched in awe as explosions blossomed mid-air, not on decks, but in the sky above them. The tactic worked. The once impossible problem of stopping a suicide dive had been blunted by one mechanic's madness turned genius. As smoke cleared and cheers echoed across the carriers, Robert Bob Hanley stood silently by the rail, watching the sea glitter beneath him. He wasn't a hero in medals or headlines, but his idea had saved thousands. What began as a desperate act of defiance in a workshop had become a shield for an entire fleet, a reminder that even in war's darkest moments, invention could turn fear into firepower.